Thessaly had always known what silence sounded like in a room full of people. She had grown up in one. But the silence that fell over the solstice feast that evening was something else entirely. It was the silence of a kingdom holding its breath. The great hall of Valdrin was packed to the walls, 500 wolves dressed in their finest, candlelight catching on silver and glass, the long banquet tables heavy with roasted game and dark wine. Thessaly sat at the high table where she had always sat, at the right hand of the Alpha King, her mate of 3 years, wearing the emerald gown she had chosen because Caedmon once told her it matched the flecks in her eyes. He hadn't looked at her once all evening. She had noticed. Of course she had noticed. She had been noticing for months now, cataloging every missed glance, every conversation cut short. Every night he came to bed after she was already asleep and rose before she woke. She had told herself it was the burden of the crown. She had told herself she was being foolish. She had lied to herself with such skill that she almost believed it. Caedmon stood. The hall fell quiet in stages, the lower tables first, then the middle, then the nobles closest to the front, until the only sound was the crackle of the enormous hearth behind the high table. He was devastating to look at, even now. Tall and broad-shouldered, dark hair pushed back from a face that belonged on a war banner, jaw cut sharp enough to draw blood. His gray eyes swept the room with the calm authority of a man who had never once doubted his right to lead. "Tonight," Caedmon said, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner, "I address a matter of the heart." Thessaly's pulse quickened. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She saw the looks, the quick glances in her direction, and something cold began to bloom behind her ribs. "For months now, I have carried a truth I could no longer keep silent." He paused, and the silence thickened. "My heart belongs to another." The cold thing in Thessaly's chest cracked open and began to spread. She watched him turn, not to her, but to the far end of the high table where a woman sat draped in red silk, with hair like spun copper and a mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Lysara fell, the ambassador's daughter who had arrived at court 6 months ago with trunks of perfume and a laugh that carried through walls. "I have chosen Lady Lysara as my queen consort," Caedmon announced, "and I ask the court to welcome her at my side." The room went still. Every pair of eyes in the hall shifted to Thessaly. She could feel the pity, the shock, the morbid fascination of people watching a woman's life collapse in real time. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table, fingers splayed against the wood, and focused on the grain beneath her fingertips until her vision stopped swimming. 3 years. 3 years of standing beside him through border wars and famine negotiations, and the long, terrible winter when the southern Pax had threatened to secede. 3 years of his scent on her skin and his heartbeat against her ear in the dark, and the bond between them humming like a second pulse. He hadn't even told her privately first. Lysara was smiling now, openly, and the expression had the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She rose from her chair and moved toward Caedmon, her hand outstretched. Something snapped in Thessaly's chest. Not the bond. Not yet. Something older. Something quieter. The part of her that had spent 3 years making herself small enough to fit beside a king without casting a shadow. Thessaly stood. The scrape of her chair against the stone floor cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned. Caedmon's hand, still extended toward Lysara, froze in midair. Thessaly walked toward him. Her legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, but they carried her steadily, one foot in front of the other, until she stood close enough to see the faint pulse jumping at the base of his throat. She searched his face, searched his eyes for something, anything, the man who had whispered her name against her temple in the dark. The man who had once told her that losing her would unmake him. She found nothing. His gaze was flat and distant, like looking through glass at a stranger. "Thessaly," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like an afterthought. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give this room that. Instead, she reached deep inside herself, past the grief and the humiliation and the jagged edges of her breaking heart, and found the bond. It was still there, golden and warm and alive, connecting her to him like a thread of light strung between two ribs. She had loved that bond. She had built her entire world around it. Thessaly wrapped her will around it and pulled. The ancient words came out of her mouth in a language older than the kingdom, older than the Pax, words that no Luna had spoken in over 200 years because the act they commanded was considered worse than death. She spoke them clearly, steadily, with a voice that did not shake. The bond shattered. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. It hit them both at the same time. Caedmon staggered, his hand flying to his chest, his face draining of color. A sound tore from his throat, low and animal and desperate. Thessaly felt it too, a white-hot tearing sensation behind her sternum, like something essential being ripped out by the root. Her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the table and stayed upright through sheer force of will. The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone shouted for the healers. But Thessaly was already moving. She straightened, pressed her hand against the place where the bond used to live, and walked toward the doors. No one stopped her. No one dared. She walked through the great doors into the corridor beyond. She walked past the guards who stared at her with wide eyes. She walked past the servants who pressed themselves against the walls. She walked down the grand staircase and through the entrance hall, and out into the cold evening air where the sun was sinking below the western ridge in a blaze of copper and gold. The pain came in waves now. Each step sent a fresh pulse of agony through her chest, as though the bond were still tearing, still splintering into smaller and smaller pieces. Her wolf howled inside her, clawing at the edges of her control, begging her to turn around, to go back, to undo what she had done. Thessaly gritted her teeth and kept walking. She had made her choice. He had made his first. By the time the sun touched the horizon, Thessaly had crossed the border of Valdran lands. By the time it disappeared, so had she. The bond was gone, and something was wrong with his head. Caedmon sat in his council chamber at dawn, still wearing the clothes from the feast, and tried to understand what had happened. The chair beside him was empty. It had always been empty. No, that wasn't right. Someone used to sit there. Someone whose name tasted like grief on his tongue. Thessaly. He said the name aloud, and the sound of it opened a void in his chest so vast he nearly doubled over. His hand pressed against his ribs where the bond had been, where he could still feel the ragged edges of its absence like torn fabric. The pain was constant, a dull, grinding ache that sharpened without warning into something that stole his breath. Theron stood across the table with his arms folded and murder in his eyes. "Explain it to me," the beta said. His voice was quiet in the way that meant he was moments from violence. "Explain to me why you stood in front of the entire kingdom and threw away the best thing that ever happened to you." Caedmon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because the truth was, he couldn't explain it. He remembered standing. He remembered speaking. He remembered the words leaving his mouth with absolute conviction, but when he reached for the reasoning behind them, the logic, the emotion, the decision itself, there was nothing. A blank space where a thought should have been, like a page torn from a book. "I chose," he started. "You chose Lysara," Theron finished, the name landing like a slap. "Over your mate, over your Luna, over the woman who held this kingdom together while you played war games on the border. You chose a woman you've known for 6 months, over one who has bled for you for 3 years." Every word landed with surgical precision, and Caedmon had no defense. "Where is she?" Caedmon asked. Theron's jaw tightened. "Gone." "What do you mean gone?" "I mean gone, Caedmon. Vanished. No trail. No scent. No trace." The beta's voice cracked on the last word, and Caedmon saw something he had never seen in Theron's face before. Grief. Unguarded, uncontrolled grief. The border scouts found nothing. The trackers lost her scent at the river crossing near Ashenmere, and it simply ends. Like she dissolved into the water. Caedmon stood, his chair scraping back. Then send more trackers. I already have. Every wolf I can spare. Send more. Theron stared at him with an expression that bordered on disgust. You publicly replaced her last night. You humiliated her in front of the entire kingdom. And now you want to drag her back? That isn't what Caedmon stopped. The hollow in his chest pulsed. Something is wrong, Theron. Yes, the beta agreed coldly. You are what's wrong. A knock sounded at the door. Lysera entered without waiting, dressed in ivory silk with her copper hair loose around her shoulders. She moved to Caedmon's side and placed her hand on his arm, and something happened that Caedmon couldn't quite name. A softening. A warmth that spread from the point of contact up through his shoulder and into his chest, dulling the ache where the bond had been. My love, Lysera murmured. You should rest. Last night was overwhelming. Her voice was honey. Her scent was sweet and heavy, wrapping around him like smoke. Caedmon felt his thoughts slow, felt the sharp edges of his panic begin to blur. He blinked hard, fighting it, fighting the fog that was settling over his mind like a warm blanket. Thessaly is missing, he said, though the words felt thick in his mouth. Lysera's hand tightened on his arm. She left of her own choosing, Caedmon. You have to respect that. It sounded reasonable. It sounded true. He felt himself nodding. Across the table, Theron watched the exchange, and something shifted in the beta's expression. Something sharp and suspicious that he hid quickly behind a mask of professional neutrality. I'll handle the search, Theron said carefully, his gaze locked on Lysera's hand where it rested on the king's arm. Lysera smiled at him. The smile didn't reach her eyes. After she had guided Caedmon from the room, murmuring soft reassurances against his shoulder, Theron stood alone in the council chamber and stared at the door they had walked through. He pressed his fingers against the table and breathed slowly through his nose. Something is very wrong with the king, he said to the empty room. Then he left to find the one person who might understand what he had just seen. The kingdom began to fall apart in small ways first. It started with the grain disputes. 3 villages on the northern border sent formal complaints within the same week, each one referencing a mediation agreement that had apparently been brokered by the Luna's office and was now unenforceable because the Luna's office no longer existed. Theron found the original documents in Thessaly's study, a small room adjoining the royal chambers that Caedmon had apparently forgotten was there. The handwriting was precise and elegant, every clause carefully worded, every contingency accounted for. She had solved a conflict that had been simmering for 2 years, and she had done it so quietly that no one in the court even knew it had existed. That was the first thing Theron discovered. It was not the last. Over the following days, the full scope of what Thessaly had been doing revealed itself like a map unfolding. She had managed the healer network across 7 districts. She had maintained personal correspondence with the wives and mates of every allied pack leader, a diplomatic web so intricate that its sudden absence sent ripples of confusion across 4 territories. She had overseen the castle's food stores, the servant rotations, the distribution of winter supplies to the outer settlements. She had kept a detailed ledger of every vulnerable family in Valdren, widows, orphans, elderly wolves living alone, and had arranged quiet support for each one. No one had asked her to do any of it. No one had even known. Theron sat in her study surrounded by her files and felt his throat tighten with a fury so hot it burned. She had been invisible. She had poured herself into the bones of this kingdom, and the king hadn't even noticed she was doing it. He found a letter tucked between 2 ledgers, unsealed, unfinished. The handwriting was less steady here. the words more vulnerable. "I have tried to be enough," it read. "I have tried to fill every space that needed filling, to solve every problem before it reached your desk, to be so useful that perhaps you would remember I was here. But you do not look at me anymore, and I am beginning to understand that you never truly saw me at all." Theron folded the letter carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and left the study. Meanwhile, Caedmon was fracturing. He moved through his days in a fog that thickened and thinned without pattern. Some hours he felt clear, present, certain that his choice had been correct, and that Lysara was his future. Other hours the clarity shattered without warning, and he found himself standing in rooms he didn't remember entering, staring at objects he couldn't name, reaching for a presence that wasn't there. He would catch a scent in the corridor, faint and familiar, something warm and green that made his wolf press forward with a desperate whine. And then Lysara would appear at his elbow, and the scent would vanish, and his thoughts would smooth, and he would forget what he had been searching for. The dreams were worse. He dreamed of golden light and a voice he could almost recognize, warm hands against his face, laughter that made something in his chest ache with a longing so profound it woke him gasping. But when he opened his eyes, the details dissolved like mist, leaving only the ache and a name he couldn't quite reach. Lysara was always there when he woke, her hand on his chest, her scent surrounding him, her voice murmuring reassurances that slid into his ears like oil. "You were dreaming again," she would say. "It's just the bond scar. It will fade." And he would believe her. He always believed her. Until the afternoon he didn't. It happened in the council chamber. A routine meeting, border reports, and supply logistics, the kind of tedious governance that usually required no emotional investment at all. One of the advisors mentioned a supply route to the eastern settlements, a route that had been established the previous winter, and Caedmon opened his mouth to respond, and a memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Thessaly standing in this room, at that table, arguing with 3 senior advisors twice her age about the eastern supply route. Her cheeks flushed with conviction, her hands gesturing as she laid out her case, her voice steady and certain. And him watching her from across the table with something so fierce and tender in his chest that it made his ribs ache. He had been proud of her. He had been so proud of her, it had taken his breath away. The memory vanished as quickly as it had come, but it left a crack. A hairline fracture in the smooth, foggy surface of his certainty, and through that crack, doubt flooded in. He turned to look at Lysara, who sat in the chair where Thessaly used to sit, and for the first time, something in his gut recoiled. That evening, Theron walked the eastern corridor toward the healer's wing, the unfinished letter pressing against his chest like a coal. The old healer Era was waiting for him in her study, a windowless room that smelled of dried sage and tallow candles. She was ancient by wolf standards, her white hair braided down her back, her dark eyes sharp beneath heavy lids. "You've noticed it too," Theron said without preamble. Era's expression was grim. "His scent has changed," she said, slowly over months, "but it has changed. There is something layered beneath it now, something sweet and artificial that shouldn't be there." "Since Lysara arrived," Theron confirmed. "Since before that, I suspect." Era folded her hands. "But it accelerated when she came. Whatever this is, it didn't start at the feast. The feast was the final act of something that has been building for a very long time." Theron sat down heavily. "Then the king's choice was not his own." "That is what I intend to find out," Era replied. "But I need access to him. Alone, without that woman anywhere near." Theron's jaw hardened. "I'll arrange it." "And the Luna?" Era asked. "Any word?" "Nothing," Theron said, and the word tasted like ash. "The bond feels completely dead from what I can sense. She wanted to be unfindable." Era was quiet for a moment. "A bond that old, that deep, doesn't sever without catastrophic pain behind it," she said. That woman didn't just leave Theron, she cut herself in half to get free. Whatever she saw in his eyes that night, whatever she felt through the bond in that moment, it was bad enough that she chose the worst agony a wolf can experience over staying. Theron thought of the letter in his pocket. The careful handwriting growing unsteady. The quiet desperation of a woman who had tried to be enough, and finally understood she wasn't. "We're going to fix this," he said. Era looked at him with eyes that had seen too many broken things to be optimistic. "First, we need to understand what was done to him," she said, "and pray that whatever it was can be undone. Because if that bond is truly dead, no amount of fixing will bring her back." Theron stood, straightened his coat, and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "There's one more thing you should know," he said, without turning around. When the Luna spoke the severance words, I watched the king's face. For one moment, less than a heartbeat, something broke through whatever is clouding him. Something horrified and desperate. He turned to look at Era. He tried to reach for her. His hand moved toward her before the pain hit, before whatever is controlling him pulled him back. He tried to stop her, and his own body wouldn't let him. Era's face went pale. "He's in there," Theron said quietly, "somewhere underneath all of it. He's still in there." Era worked quickly once Theron arranged the audience. It took 2 days. 2 days of careful maneuvering to get Lysara away from Caedmon long enough for the healer to do what needed to be done. Theron fabricated a diplomatic reception in the East Wing, a small affair requiring the future Queen Consort's attendance, and Lysara had gone reluctantly, her eyes lingering on Caedmon as she left the room, her fingers trailing across his wrist in a gesture that looked like affection, but landed like a leash. The moment she was gone, Theron brought Era to the king's private study. Caedmon looked terrible. The circles beneath his eyes had deepened to bruises. His skin had taken on a grayish cast that no amount of sleep could explain. He sat behind his desk, surrounded by reports he clearly hadn't read, and when Era entered, he blinked at her with the slow, unfocused gaze of a man surfacing from deep water. "Your Majesty?" Era said, keeping her voice gentle. "I need to examine you." "I'm fine," Caedmon said automatically. "You are not fine," Theron said from the doorway. "You haven't been fine in months. Let her look." Something flickered in Caedmon's expression, a flash of the man he had once been, sharp and commanding and certain. Then it dimmed. "Fine," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Make it quick." Era moved to his side and began with the standard healer's assessment: pulse, pupils, breath pattern. All within range, all unremarkable. Then she leaned closer and inhaled carefully near the base of his throat, where a wolf's scent was strongest. Her face changed. "Breathe out for me slowly," she instructed. Caedmon obeyed. Era closed her eyes and inhaled again, deeper this time, and when she opened her eyes, the look in them made Theron's blood run cold. "What?" the beta demanded. Era didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her satchel and produced a small glass vial filled with a pale amber liquid. She uncorked it and held it beneath Caedmon's nose. "Tell me what you smell." Caedmon frowned. "Nothing." "Try again." He inhaled. "I told you, nothing. It's odorless." Ira corked the vial and turned to Theron. "This is pure starbloom extract. It has one of the strongest scents in the natural world. A wolf should be able to detect it from 3 rooms away." She paused. "He can't smell it at all." "What does that mean?" Theron asked. "It means someone has been systematically dulling his senses for months," Era said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "His olfactory receptors are suppressed, selectively. He can smell what he's being allowed to smell and nothing else. Whoever did this understands wolf biology at a level that goes far beyond common herbcraft." The silence that followed was suffocating. Caedmon stared at Era, and something was happening behind his eyes, A slow, terrible dawning, like watching a man realize the floor beneath him was glass, and the drop below was infinite. "That's not possible," he said. "I need to examine the bond scar," Era replied. Caedmon's hand moved instinctively to his chest, pressing flat against his ribs where the bond had once lived. "It's healed." "May I see?" He unbuttoned his shirt slowly, his fingers clumsy like they'd forgotten the mechanics. He pulled the fabric aside to reveal the skin over his heart. Era's sharp intake of breath filled the room. The bond scar should have been just that. A scar. A faded mark where the connection had been. Painful, but closed. What Era saw instead was an open wound, inflamed and angry, the skin around it threaded with dark veins that spread outward like roots, seeking soil. The veins pulsed faintly, rhythmically, in a pattern that had nothing to do with his heartbeat. "This isn't a broken bond," Era whispered. "This is a cage." Caedmon looked down at his own chest and the color drained from his face. "What is that? Why does it look like that?" "Because something is feeding on the place where your bond used to be," Era said. "Something planted there deliberately. The bond didn't just break, Your Majesty. It was forced open, and something else was put inside. Whatever compound is suppressing your senses is also anchored here, using the wound as a doorway into your emotional center." Theron crossed the room in 3 strides. "Lysara." "I cannot confirm that without more examination," Era said carefully, though her expression suggested the caution was professional courtesy rather than genuine doubt. Caedmon was staring at his chest, at the dark veins pulsing against his skin. His hand trembled. "I can't," he started, then stopped. His eyes squeezed shut, and when he spoke again, his voice was stripped to nothing. "I can't remember why I chose her." The confession hung in the air like smoke. "I've been trying," he continued, his words coming faster now, tumbling over each other. "Every time I reach for the reason, the thought, the moment I decided, there's nothing there. It's like trying to hold water. I know I stood up. I know I said the words. But I don't know why. I don't know why I said them." Theron gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles went white. "Because you didn't say them. Something else did." Caedmon looked at his beta, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes were fully clear, fully present. And what Theron saw in them was horror. "Thessaly," the king breathed, and the name came out like a prayer and an apology in the same broken syllable. Then the study door opened and Lysara swept in, earlier than expected, her smile already in place. "There you are, my love. I was looking for—" She stopped. Her gaze dropped to Caedmon's exposed chest, to the dark veins visible above his open shirt, to Ira standing over him with the vial in her hand. Something crossed Lysara's face. It was there and gone in less than a heartbeat, but Theron caught it. Not surprise, not concern. Calculation. "What's happening here?" Lysara asked, her voice honeyed with worry. She moved toward Caedmon, her hand outstretched. "Don't touch him," Era commanded sharply. Everyone froze. Lysara's hand hung in the air between them. Her eyes, warm and wide and loving a moment before, flickered. Just once. Just enough. "I beg your pardon?" Lysara said softly. "Medical examination." Theron intervened smoothly, stepping between Lysara and the king. "The bond scar requires treatment, standard protocol. You understand." Lysara's smile returned, but it sat differently on her face now. Tighter, less practiced. "Of course," she said. "I'll wait outside." She left. The door closed. Era turned to Theron, her face ashen. "Get her away from him," the healer said. "Tonight. Whatever it takes. Every moment she touches him, it gets worse." "And the king?" Theron asked. Ira looked at Caedmon, who sat motionless, staring at the dark veins on his chest with the expression of a man watching his own house burn. "I need to purge whatever this is," she said quietly. But I must warn you both. When the fog lifts, when he can truly feel again, the pain of what happened, of what he did, will hit him all at once, and it will be devastating. Caedmon's voice came out barely above a whisper. I deserve that. Neither Era nor Theron disagreed. The purging took 3 days. Era worked in shifts, 4 hours on and 2 hours off, cycling through a rotating battery of cleansing tonics and scent neutralizers, designed to strip away whatever compound had been layered into Caedmon's system. She refused to let Lysara into the room. She refused to let anyone in except Theron and 2 healers she trusted with her life. Caedmon suffered. There was no gentler word for it. As the foreign substance was drawn out of his blood, his body revolted. Fever came first, then tremors so violent they shook the heavy oak bed frame against the stone floor. He sweated through 3 sets of sheets in the first night alone, his skin burning hot to the touch, and then ice cold within minutes. His wolf, suppressed for months, surged forward and retreated in agonizing waves, clawing for dominance inside a body that no longer knew how to contain it. But the worst part was the memories. They came back in fragments, shattered pieces of a life he had forgotten, and each one hit him like a fist to the chest. Thessaly laughing in the kitchen garden, dirt on her hands and sunlight in her hair, turning to look at him with a warmth that made the world feel simple. Thessaly standing beside him during the Southern Pact negotiations, her hand steady on his arm, whispering the name of an ambassador's mate he had forgotten so he wouldn't embarrass himself. Thessaly in their bed, tracing patterns on his shoulder in the dark, telling him about a widow in the lower village who needed firewood and a child in the eastern settlement whose mother had died and who had no one. She had carried all of it. Every fractured, forgotten, invisible piece of the kingdom's heart, and she had carried it silently, without complaint, without recognition, because she believed that was her purpose. To be useful, to be enough, and he had let her become invisible. That was the memory that broke him. Not a grand moment, not a fight or a betrayal or a dramatic collapse. A Tuesday afternoon in the corridor outside the council chamber. Thessaly walking toward him with a stack of papers and a tentative smile, opening her mouth to say something, and Caedmon walking past her without stopping, without looking, without even slowing down. He had been thinking about something. He couldn't remember what. Something that had seemed important at the time, and she had been right there. And he had walked through her presence like she was made of air. The look on her face as he passed. He hadn't seen it then. He saw it now. Stop, Caedmon groaned, pressing his palms against his eyes. I can't. You must, Era said firmly. The memories are returning because the compound is leaving your system. If you fight it, you'll push them back down and we'll have to start over. Then let me start over, he gasped. I don't want to see. You need to see, Theron said from the chair beside the bed. The beta hadn't left since the purging began. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but his voice was steady. You need to see what you lost. Another memory. A winter evening, Thessaly sitting by the fire mending a tear in his ceremonial cloak, because the castle tailor was ill and she didn't want to burden anyone else. He had walked in, seen her there, and felt a surge of love so overwhelming it had stopped him in the doorway. He had almost told her. The words had been right there, gathered and ready. Instead, he had asked if she'd seen his hunting boots. The sound that came out of Caedmon's throat was something between a laugh and a sob. She was my whole world, he said, his voice cracking open. She was my whole world, and I let something crawl into my head and convince me she was nothing. Era exchanged a look with Theron. The compound made you susceptible, she said carefully. But it worked by amplifying what was already there. The distance, the inattention. Those were real. The enchantment didn't create your neglect. It exploited it. The words pressed against the wound, not cutting deeper, but refusing to let him look away from its full depth. I know, Caedmon whispered. On the third day, the fever broke. Caedmon woke clear-headed for the first time in what felt like years. The world was sharp-edged and vivid, colors brighter, sounds crisper, and the absence of Thessaly was a howling void that filled every corner of every room. He could smell again. Really smell, not the muffled, selective awareness that Lysara's compound had permitted, but the full, overwhelming flood of a wolf's senses restored. He could smell the pine resin in the walls, the rain approaching from the west, the iron in his own blood where the dark veins on his chest were finally beginning to recede. And beneath it all, like a ghost, the faintest trace of lavender and warm cedar embedded in the fabric of his pillow. Her scent, still here, after weeks. He pressed his face into the pillow and breathed in so deeply his lungs ached. The bond scar throbbed. Era examined it that morning and found the dark veins retreating, the angry inflammation fading to something merely tender. But the scar itself remained open. Not healing. Not closing. It should be closing by now, Era murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. A severed bond scars over within days. This one has been open for weeks. What does that mean? Theron asked. Era traced the edge of the wound with a careful finger, her brow furrowed. I'm not certain, but in the old texts, there are references to incomplete severances, bonds where one partner speaks the words but the other's wolf refuses to release. She looked at Caedmon. When the Luna broke the bond, did you feel your side release? Caedmon thought back to that moment. The hall. The words. The white-hot tearing in his chest. I felt pain, he said. And then fog. The same fog that had been covering everything for months, but thicker. But did you let go? Era pressed. Did your wolf let go of her? Caedmon closed his eyes, reached inward, past the pain and the guilt and the gaping wound in his chest, and searched for the place where the bond had lived. His wolf surged forward, frantic, desperate, and he felt it. A thread, so thin it was almost nothing, so faint that a breath could break it. But there, still there, stretching out into the dark like a single strand of spider silk. No, Caedmon breathed. I didn't let go. Era sat back slowly. Then the bond isn't dead. Theron leaned forward. What does that mean for finding her? It means the thread goes both ways, Era said. If he didn't let go, and the thread survived, then some part of her is still connected to him. She'll feel it. Faintly, distantly, but she'll feel it. And it means something else, she added quietly, looking at Caedmon with an expression that was equal parts hope and warning. A bond can only survive a severance if both wolves refuse to truly release. She spoke the words, but her wolf held on. The implication settled over the room like the first light of dawn. She didn't want it gone, Caedmon said, his voice breaking. She broke it because she thought she had to, but she didn't want it gone. Neither did you, Era replied. The silence that followed was fragile, trembling, and full of a grief too large for words. They confronted Lysara on the fourth day. Theron had spent the preceding 3 days building a case with the precision of a man dismantling a trap wire by wire. He had collected scent samples from Caedmon's clothing, from the sheets in the royal chambers, from the wine goblets Lysara personally poured each evening. He had traced her movements through the castle, mapped her contacts, identified 3 servants who delivered parcels to her rooms from outside the kingdom's borders. He had found the source, a small glass bottle hidden in a compartment sewn into the lining of Lysara's traveling trunk. The liquid inside was colorless and nearly odorless to a suppressed wolf. Era identified it within minutes. Moonlay's tincture, the healer said, holding the bottle up to the candlelight. The liquid caught the flame and threw prismatic shadows across the wall. Refined to a concentration I've never seen outside of textbooks. This isn't folk magic, Theron. This is alchemy. Expensive, deliberate, and designed for one specific purpose. Which is? Theron asked, Scent manipulation, emotional suppression, targeted bond interference. Ira set the bottle down with exaggerated care, as if it might shatter and release something worse than what it already had. In small doses, it creates a mild, euphoric attachment to whoever administers it. In the doses she's been using, it rewrites the wolf's emotional architecture entirely. It buries existing bonds, implants artificial ones, and suppresses the host's ability to recognize what's been done. Theron stared at the bottle. She didn't seduce him, she poisoned him. Slowly, over months, building the dosage so gradually that his body adapted without triggering a defensive response. Ira's hands were shaking. She was angry, Theron realized, angrier than he had ever seen the old healer. This is not the work of an ambitious woman acting alone. This compound requires resources and expertise that go far beyond a single ambassador's daughter. Someone supplied her. Someone funded this. The arrest was swift and ugly. 4 guards escorted Lysara from her chambers at dawn. She came out in silk and composure, her copper hair perfectly arranged, her expression one of wounded confusion so convincing that 2 of the guards hesitated. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "Theron, please, let me speak to Caedmon." "The king doesn't wish to speak with you," Theron replied. Something changed in Lysara's face then. The mask didn't slip so much as it dissolved, and what emerged beneath it was cold and hard and utterly unrecognizable from the warm, laughing woman who had charmed her way through 6 months of court life. "He'll fall apart without me," Lysara said. Her voice had dropped the tremor. It was flat now, clinical, the voice of someone reporting a fact. "The compound is the only thing holding him together. Without it, the bond scar will consume him. He'll go mad from the withdrawal before the week is out." "That sounds like a confession," Theron observed. Lysara smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her, and it was terrifying. "You think you've won something. You haven't. You've just accelerated the damage. By the time you find your precious Luna, there won't be anything left of him worth saving." The guards took her away. Theron stood in the empty corridor and let himself feel the full weight of what she had said, because beneath the cruelty and the calculation, part of it was true. Caedmon was not recovering. He was getting worse. The withdrawal hit like a second siege. Without Lysara's compound smoothing his system, every emotion he had been shielded from for 6 months arrived simultaneously. The grief of the broken bond, the horror of what he had done at the feast, the crushing guilt of every moment he had neglected Thessaly, the physical agony of a bond scar that refused to heal, all of it crashed into him in a single unrelenting wave. He stopped eating on the 2nd day, stopped speaking on the 3rd. By the 4th day after Lysara's arrest, Caedmon was curled on the floor of the royal chambers with his arms wrapped around his chest, shaking violently, his wolf howling inside him with a sound that no one else could hear, but everyone in the castle could feel. The servants whispered in the corridors. The court advisors held emergency sessions without their king. The border patrols reported growing unrest in the outer territories, where word of the Luna's departure had spread. 2 allied pacts sent formal inquiries about the stability of their treaties, inquiries that would have been handled and resolved by Thessaly before they ever reached the council table. Valdrin was a kingdom without a center, a wheel without a hub, and everything was beginning to spin apart. Theron found him there in the gray light of early morning. The beta knelt beside his king and put a hand on his shoulder. "Get up," Theron said quietly. Caedmon didn't respond. "She's alive, Caedmon. Thessaly is alive somewhere. And the threat is still there. Get up." Nothing. Theron reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the unfinished letter. He unfolded it carefully and held it in front of Caedmon's face. "Read it," the beta commanded. Caedmon's eyes focused slowly on the handwriting, Thessaly's handwriting. The words blurred and sharpened as his vision swam. He read it once, read it again. I have tried to be enough. A sound came out of him that wasn't a word. It was something deeper. Something broken at a frequency that vibrated in the bones. He pressed the letter against his chest, against the open wound where the bond lived, and the thread inside him pulsed so faintly it could have been imagined. But Caedmon felt it. He felt it reach out into the distance, stretching toward something far away, and at the very end of that impossible thread, faint as a heartbeat heard through a wall, he felt her, alive, in pain, alone. He was on his feet in seconds, swaying, his legs barely holding him, but standing. "Where?" he demanded, his voice cracked and burning with a determination that hadn't been there moments before. "Where is she?" Theron stared at him. "We've had scouts in every territory. There's been nothing." "The border villages," Caedmon said, pressing his hand harder against his chest, chasing the faint pull of the thread. "South. Past Ashenmere. She would have gone somewhere no one would think to look. Somewhere she could be useful without being seen." Theron processed this for a moment. The healer settlements, the ones in the valley beyond the southern ridge. Caedmon nodded, his jaw set so tight the muscles in his neck corded. "She's a healer. She wouldn't stop being a healer just because she stopped being a Luna. She would have found a village that needed one." Theron was already moving toward the door. "I'll send riders." "No," Caedmon said. The word came out with an authority that had been absent for months, low and absolute and unmistakable. "I'm going myself. You can barely stand. Then I'll crawl." Theron looked at his king, at the hollow cheeks and the trembling hands and the open wound bleeding through his shirt, and saw something he hadn't seen since before Lysara Fell walked through the castle gates. Certainty. Not the manufactured, fog-wrapped certainty of the enchantment. The real thing, sharp-edged and desperate and willing to burn through whatever stood in its way. "You're going to terrify her," Theron warned, "showing up like this, half-dead and wild-eyed." "Good," Caedmon replied. "She should know what losing her has done." Era appeared in the doorway, summoned by the noise. She took one look at Caedmon standing upright and raised an eyebrow. "He's going after her," Theron explained. "Of course he is," Era muttered. She crossed to her satchel and began pulling out vials. "You'll need these for the journey, one at dawn, one at dusk. They'll keep the withdrawal symptoms manageable. If you stop taking them, you will collapse within hours, and I am not going to be there to pick you up." Caedmon took the vials. His hands were steadier now. The thread in his chest pulled south like a compass needle, faint but constant, and every fiber of his body strained to follow it. "One more thing," Era said, catching his arm before he could turn away. "When you find her, and I believe you will, you need to understand something. You cannot undo what happened by explaining it. The enchantment, the manipulation. Those are reasons, but they are not absolution. She didn't leave because Lysara poisoned you. She left because you had already been losing her long before that woman arrived. If you want her back, you have to reckon with that." Caedmon met the old healer's eyes. "I know." "Do you?" Era pressed. "Because the man who walked past his mate in a corridor without looking at her, that man wasn't enchanted. That man was simply careless, and that is the man she will see when you stand before her." The words cut deeper than anything Lysara's compound had ever done. Caedmon swallowed hard and nodded once. Then he walked out of the room, down the corridor, through the entrance hall, and into the pale morning light where two horses stood saddled and waiting. Theron was already mounted. "You didn't think I'd let you go alone," the beta said. For the first time in months, something that wasn't grief or horror flickered across Caedmon's face. Something fragile and grateful, and desperately close to the man Theron remembered. They rode south before the castle had fully woken, chasing a thread only one of them could feel, toward a woman who had every reason to never be found. The village of Brindell sat in a narrow valley between two ridges at the southern edge of Valdrin territory, so remote that even the border patrols rarely passed through. It was the kind of place that survived on stubbornness and root vegetables, a handful of stone cottages clustered around a well, surrounded by sheep pastures that climbed the hillsides in uneven terraces. Caedmon and Theron reached it on the third day of riding. The journey had nearly destroyed him. Despite Era's tonics, the withdrawal came in waves that left him doubled over in the saddle, his vision whiting out, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. Theron said nothing during these episodes, just rode close enough to steady his king if needed, and looked straight ahead with the practiced patience of a man who had been holding things together for a very long time. The thread guided them. It was stronger now, pulling with a persistence that Caedmon felt behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. South and slightly west, down through the pine forests and across the river at Ashenmere, past the last outpost and into country so wild that the road became a trail, became a suggestion, became nothing at all. When they crested the final ridge and saw the village below, the thread went taut in Caedmon's chest and he knew. "She's here," he said. They tied the horses at the edge of the village and walked in on foot. A woman carrying water stopped and stared at them with the wide-eyed alarm of someone who had never seen a king in person and fervently wished to maintain that record. A child ran behind a fence. An old man on a bench regarded them with the squinting suspicion that small villages reserved for outsiders. "We're looking for a healer," Theron said to the old man. "A woman. She would have arrived several weeks ago." The old man's eyes narrowed further. "We've got a healer. What do you want with her?" "Just to speak with her," Theron replied. The old man looked at Caedmon, at the hollow cheeks and the haunted eyes, and the way his hand pressed unconsciously against his chest, and something in his expression shifted from suspicion to recognition. Not of the king himself, but of the wound. "End of the lane," the old man said. "The cottage with the herb garden, but she won't thank you for coming." The cottage was small and immaculately kept, with window boxes overflowing with lavender and rosemary and a dozen other plants Caedmon couldn't name, but whose scents reached him even from 20 paces away. Now that his senses had been restored, the smell hit him so hard his knees nearly buckled. Her scent, alive and green and achingly familiar, woven into every leaf and petal like a signature. He stood at the gate and could not make himself move. "Go," Theron said quietly from behind him. Caedmon walked up the path and knocked on the door. It opened and Thessaly stood before him. She was thinner. The soft curves he remembered had sharpened into angles, and the shadows beneath her eyes rivaled his own. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a plain linen dress with herb stains on the sleeves. She looked exhausted and fierce and beautiful and completely, utterly stunned to see him. "No," she said. The word hit him with the force of a closed door. "Thessaly, please." "No." She moved to close the door. He caught it with his hand, not forcefully, just enough to hold it open. "I was enchanted," he said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Lysara was dosing me with moonlace tincture for months. She suppressed my senses, manipulated my emotions, interfered with our bond. The choice at the feast was not my choice. None of it was my choice." Thessaly stared at him. He watched the information land, watched her process it, watched something flicker behind her eyes that might have been hope before it was extinguished by something harder and colder. "You let her in," Thessaly said. Caedmon flinched. "Whatever she did to you, however she did it, she got close enough to do it because you let her. You let her sit beside you at meals. You let her walk with you in the gardens. You let her pour your wine every evening while I sat across the table watching my mate smile at another woman." Her voice didn't waver. It was steady and precise, and it carved through him with surgical efficiency. "That wasn't a potion, Caedmon. That was a choice. 100 small choices every single day to turn toward her and away from me." I know, he whispered. Do you? Thessaly's composure cracked for the first time, and beneath it was a fury so white-hot it stole the air from the space between them. Because I felt it through the bond. Every time you looked at her, I felt it. Every time your attention shifted, every time your warmth pulled away from me and toward her, I felt it like a hand closing around my throat. Months before the feast, months before whatever potion she was using took full hold, you were already leaving me. Caedmon's vision blurred. He tasted salt on his lips. The enchantment made it worse, Thessaly continued, her voice dropping to something stripped and unprotected. But it didn't start it. You started it. You stopped looking at me. You stopped asking how I was. You stopped reaching for me in the dark. Her jaw tightened. The last time you said my name like it mattered was the autumn equinox. I counted, Caedmon. I counted the days. He couldn't speak. Everything she said was true, and the truth was more devastating than anything Lysara's compound had ever done to him, because he couldn't blame it on poison. He couldn't blame it on magic. He could only blame it on himself. And then you stood up in front of 500 people, Thessaly said, her voice finally breaking. And you confirmed what I had been afraid of for months. That I was invisible. That I had never been enough. You were everything, Caedmon said, and the words came out wrecked. You were everything, and I was too blind and too careless to see it, and I am so sorry, Thessaly. I am so sorry. She closed her eyes. Tears slid down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Theron stepped forward then, carefully, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. My lady, the beta said. I brought something you should see. He pulled from his coat a folded leather case and opened it. Inside were Era's notes, the scent analysis, the compound identification, the illustration of the bond scar with its dark veins, the testimony from the servants who had carried Lysara's parcels, the full, meticulous, damning record of what had been done to the king. Thessaly looked at the documents. She didn't touch them. There's something else, Theron said gently. Show her. Caedmon understood. With trembling hands, he unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it aside. Thessaly's eyes dropped to his chest. The bond scar still open. The dark veins fading, but the wound itself stubbornly refusing to close. Her hand flew to her own chest instinctively, pressing against the mirror point above her heart. It hasn't healed, she whispered, and the shock in her voice was real and unguarded. Because I didn't let go, Caedmon said. My wolf never released you. The bond is damaged, broken, but there's a thread. I felt it. I followed it here. Thessaly pressed harder against her own chest, and he watched the realization cross her face, the recognition of something she had been feeling for weeks and refusing to name. I feel it too, she admitted, so quietly he almost didn't hear. The silence between them trembled with the weight of everything said and everything still unspoken. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Caedmon said. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to let me try to become someone worth coming back to. Thessaly looked at him for a long time. Her eyes moved over his face, the hollowed cheeks, the trembling hands, the open wound on his chest, and he could see her measuring the distance between the man he had been and the man standing before her now. I'll go back to Valdren, she said at last. Not for you. For the people I left behind who needed me. Caedmon nodded. He would take that. He would take anything she was willing to give. But I sleep in my own chambers, Thessaly continued, her voice hardening again. I answer to no title, and if that woman's people come for retribution, I want a seat at the war table, not a pat on the head and a locked room. Done, Caedmon said without hesitation. And Caedmon. She held his gaze, and her eyes were fierce and wet and unflinching. If you ever stop seeing me again, I won't sever the bond next time. I'll just leave, and you will never find me. The promise landed with quiet, lethal precision. Not a wound. A warning. I see you, he said. I see you now. Thessaly studied him for one more moment. Then she stepped back from the door and opened it wider. Then come in, she said. You look terrible, and someone needs to treat that wound before it kills you. The ride back to Valdrin took 4 days. Thessaly rode beside Theron, not Caedmon. She kept a careful distance that was measured in more than horse lengths, a deliberate space that said everything words couldn't about where they stood. Caedmon didn't push it. He rode behind them and watched the straight line of her back and the way she held the reins with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and he felt the thread between them pulse with each mile that passed. She spoke to Theron easily, asking about the kingdom, about the damage, about which systems had collapsed and which had held. The beta answered with the thoroughness of a man delivering a field report, and Caedmon listened from behind and heard the full scope of his failure laid out in logistics and unmet needs. The grain disputes she had brokered, the healer network she had maintained, the diplomatic correspondence that had gone unanswered, the families she had quietly supported who were now struggling without her. Every item on the list was something he should have known about, should have noticed, should have valued. Every item was proof of a woman who had poured herself into the foundations of his kingdom while he built monuments on top and never once looked down. On the second night, they camped in a clearing beside a stream. Theron took first watch, and Thessaly sat by the fire with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea, staring into the flames. Caedmon sat across from her. The fire between them felt symbolic in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. I walked past you, he said. Thessaly looked up. In the corridor. Outside the council chamber. You were coming toward me with papers, and I walked past you without stopping. His voice was steady, but it cost him everything. I remember now. I remember the look on your face. She didn't respond. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks into the dark. You were going to tell me about the eastern supply route, he continued, the one you'd been negotiating for weeks. You'd finally resolved it, and you wanted to tell me, and I walked past you like you weren't there. You were busy, Thessaly said. The words were neutral, but her knuckles had gone white around the cup. I wasn't busy. I was careless. I had gotten so used to you holding everything together that I stopped noticing you were doing it. He leaned forward. I stopped noticing you entirely. And that is not Lysara's fault. That is mine. The firelight caught the tears gathering along her lower lashes. She blinked them back. You want to know what the worst part was? She asked. It wasn't the feast. It wasn't the announcement. It wasn't watching you choose someone else in front of the entire kingdom. She set the cup down carefully. It was the morning before. I woke up early and you were sleeping beside me. And I looked at you. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time you'd said my name. Not my title. Not a greeting. My name. The way you used to say it. Her voice fractured. A clean break through something that had been holding itself together for a very long time. And I thought, he's already gone. He's lying right here, and he's already gone. The sound that escaped Caedmon's chest was involuntary, a low, broken thing that his wolf forced out before he could stop it. He pressed his hand over the bond scar and felt the thread tremble. Thessaly, he said, and he said it the way he used to. The way he should never have stopped saying it, like it was the only word in any language that meant anything at all. She flinched. Her hand went to her own chest, mirroring his, and he saw it, the moment the thread pulsed between them, visible in the way they both inhaled sharply at the same time. Don't, she whispered. Don't say it like that unless you mean it. I mean it, he said. I mean it every time. I should have meant it every single day for 3 years, and I didn't, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. The tears spilled over. She wiped them roughly with the back of her hand, angry at herself for crying, angry at him for making her cry. I didn't want to break the bond, she admitted. And the confession came out like something pried loose by force. I wanted to. I told myself I did. I spoke the words and I meant them in the moment because the pain of watching you choose her was worse than anything the severance could do. But my wolf. She pressed harder against her chest. My wolf wouldn't let go. I've spent weeks hating myself for that. For not being strong enough to cut you out completely. That isn't weakness, Caedmon said. It feels like weakness. It feels like the truest thing either of us has done in months. The fire crackled between them. The stream murmured in the dark. Somewhere in the trees, a night bird called out and received no answer. I need you to understand something, Thessaly said, and her voice had shifted again. Quieter now, less angry, more honest. I didn't just lose you at the feast, I lost myself. I spent 3 years pouring everything I had into being your Luna, into being useful, into earning a place beside you. And when you chose her, it didn't just break the bond. It confirmed every fear I had ever carried, that I wasn't worth staying for, that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough to make someone choose me. Caedmon's chest constricted. That isn't true. I know it isn't true. I know that now, here, in this village, treating people who actually see me when I walk into a room. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was gaining strength. I'm not the same woman who left Valdrin, Caedmon. I know my own worth now, and I refuse to go back to being invisible just because you've finally learned to look. The words landed, and Caedmon felt something shift inside him. Not pain this time, but recognition. She wasn't the same. She was harder, yes, but also clearer. The woman sitting across the fire from him had walked through the worst agony a wolf could endure and come out the other side with her spine straight and her eyes open. She didn't need him anymore, not the way she once had. And that terrified him, because it meant that if she came back, it would be a choice made from strength, not desperation, and he would have to earn it every single day. I don't want you to be invisible, he said. I don't want what we had. What we had was me taking you for granted and you letting me. I want something better than that. I want something where you never have to count the days since I last said your name because I say it every morning and every night and every moment in between. She stared at him. The firelight made her eyes luminous. You're making promises, she said quietly. You always made good promises. It was the keeping of them where you fell short. The words stung because they were true. Then don't believe my promises, Caedmon said. Watch what I do. That's all I'm asking. Just watch. Thessaly was quiet for a very long time. The fire burned lower. The stars shifted overhead. One day at a time, she said finally. That's all I can give you. That's enough, he replied. That's everything. She didn't come to his side of the fire. She didn't take his hand. She didn't offer absolution or forgiveness or any of the easy comforts that a lesser story would have granted. But when she lay down to sleep and closed her eyes, the thread between them glowed faintly in the dark, and for the first time in weeks, neither of them was in pain. Theron watched from his post at the edge of the clearing and said nothing, but he allowed himself for the first time since the solstice feast to believe that this might end somewhere other than ruin. They reached Valdrin on the 4th evening, and the kingdom held its breath for the second time. Thessaly did not return as Luna. She returned as herself. She took chambers in the East Wing, far from the royal suite, and resumed her work with the Healer Network and the civilian welfare ledgers as though she had never left. The court watched with the ravenous curiosity of people who had witnessed a catastrophe and were now watching the wreckage being cleared, unsure whether the structure underneath could be salvaged. Caedmon did not push. He did not hover. He did not make grand gestures or public declarations. Instead, he did small things. He said her name every time he saw her, and he said it the way she deserved to hear it, with weight, with attention, with the full force of meaning behind every syllable. He asked about the grain disputes and listened to the full answer. He read her reports and left notes in the margins, not corrections but questions, the kind that meant he had actually read every word. He attended the healer network meetings and sat quietly in the back and didn't speak unless spoken to. When she entered a room, he looked up. Every time. Without fail. The first week, Thessaly barely looked at him. The second week, she nodded when he entered a room. The third week, she corrected his pronunciation of a border village's name during a council session, and half the table flinched, but Caedmon just repeated it correctly and said, "Thank you." The fourth week, she found a note on her desk in his handwriting. Not a love letter, not an apology. A summary of a healer funding proposal he had drafted based on the framework she had built before she left. At the bottom, in careful script, he had written, "You built this. I just put it on paper." The bond scar began to close. Slowly, painfully, the wound knitting itself into something that was not what it had been before, but was not nothing either. Ira monitored it daily and said little, but her eyes carried a cautious warmth that hadn't been there before. Every evening, Caedmon left a candle burning outside Thessaly's door, a small one, unscented, set on a stone dish so the wax wouldn't mar the wood. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. The servants who noticed said nothing. Every morning, the candle was still there, burned down to a stub, untouched. Until one morning, 5 weeks after her return, Caedmon walked past Thessaly's door and found the stone dish empty. He stopped, stared at the bare stone where the candle had been. His heart hammered so violently he could feel it in his fingertips. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see the candle on her bedside table, still burning. Its small flame casting a warm glow across the room where Thessaly sat brushing her hair in the early light. She looked up and saw him standing in the corridor. Neither of them spoke. Then Thessaly shifted slightly on the bench, making room, and Caedmon stepped inside and closed the door behind him.